There is a promise carried in certain family names, whispered across generations like an inheritance more precious than land. 14 Greek surnames, passed down through centuries of conquest, empire, and diaspora, have long been linked in popular imagination to a single, glorious origin, the warrior bloodline of Sparta. For families who carry these names, from small mountain villages in the Peloponnese to communities scattered across the world, the story felt like a birthright. Ancient blood, unbroken, running quietly beneath modern skin. Then geneticists went looking for the evidence. What they found did not simply confirm the legend of continuous Spartan descent. It complicated it, softened it, and in some cases dismantled it entirely, while opening a door onto something researchers did not expect to find at all. This is not a story about disproving Greek heritage. It is a story about what genetics can and cannot promise us, and about a history in Greece far older, far stranger, and far more layered than any single city-state could ever contain. For generations, the accepted story felt almost self-evident. Sparta rose in the archaic period as one of the most disciplined military societies in the ancient world, its citizens organized around a rigid warrior code, its bloodlines fiercely protective of Spartiate status. Families in the region of Laconia, southern Greece, have long maintained oral traditions connecting their surnames to descendants of that Spartan citizenry, names tied to specific villages, specific clans, specific legends of warriors who survived the fall of the classical world and quietly persisted through Roman rule, Byzantine centuries, Ottoman occupation, and the modern Greek state. It made intuitive sense. Isolated mountain communities, protected by geography, seemed like plausible vessels for a bloodline to survive relatively undisturbed for 2,500 years. Surnames functioned as oral archives, repeated at family tables long before anyone thought to test them against biology. But historians who studied the region closely began noticing inconsistencies that the legend could not fully absorb. Classical Sparta was never a large population to begin with. At its height, the number of true Spartiate citizens numbered only in the low thousands, a shrinking elite even before the city's decline in the 4th century BC. Ancient sources describe repeated population crises, aristocratic land consolidation that pushed families out of citizen status, and a demographic collapse that, by the time of Roman Greece, had already left Sparta as more of a symbolic identity than an intact bloodline. If the Spartiate population was that small and that fragile that early, could 14 modern surnames, spread across an entire region and beyond, really trace back to it without interruption? That question sat uncomfortably beside the legend, unanswered for a long time, because until recently, there was no tool precise enough to test it. That tool arrived through the Y chromosome, the piece of DNA passed almost unaltered from father to son across generations, along with autosomal DNA, the broader genetic inheritance drawn from every ancestral line, not just the paternal one. Together, these methods allow researchers to trace deep paternal lineages and compare them against known ancient and modern reference populations, essentially reading a genetic archive that no oral tradition, however sincere, could fully access on its own. Researchers sampled men carrying these 14 historically Laconian surnames, expecting, at minimum, a distinct regional genetic signature, something setting them apart from the rest of mainland Greece, consistent with relative isolation in the mountains and valleys long associated with ancient Laconia. If discoveries like this fascinate you, the quiet places where family legend meets hard genetic evidence, it may be worth subscribing, because Greek history alone holds far more unresolved layers than most people realize. What the data showed instead was not a single clean signature at all. It was fragmentation. Some of the 14 surname lines did carry Y chromosome haplogroups consistent with deep, ancient presence in the southern Peloponnese, stretching back plausibly into the Bronze Age. That much aligned, cautiously, with the idea of long regional continuity. But several other lines, carrying names just as strongly associated with Spartan descent in local tradition, showed haplogroups linked instead to much later population movements. Slavic migrations into Greece during the early medieval period, Byzantine-era Anatolian resettlement programs, and even, in a smaller number of cases, genetic signals connected to Ottoman-era demographic shifts. That was not a contradiction. It was a signal. The story did not collapse. It widened. A name that felt, to the families carrying it, like an unbroken thread back to antiquity was, in several documented branches, a much younger addition to the region, adopted, inherited through marriage, or granted through land and status centuries after the classical period had already ended. The surname had survived. The specific bloodline behind it, in more than one case, had quietly changed. 3 explanations now compete to account for what researchers were seeing. The first is straightforward long-term regional continuity with gradual, ordinary admixture, Laconian families whose paternal line does stretch deep into antiquity, but whose overall ancestry, like nearly every population in the Eastern Mediterranean, absorbed centuries of newcomers through marriage, trade, and settlement, all while keeping the same inherited surname across that mixing. The second is a founder effect scenario layered on top of migration. Later medieval populations, some of Slavic or Anatolian origin, settling into Laconian villages and, over a few generations, either marrying into existing Spartan-descended families or simply adopting prestigious local surnames tied to Spartan identity, a practice not unusual in regions where a name could carry social and even legal advantages. The third, and the most cautious of the 3, points toward Greece's much older, much deeper genetic layering, a Bronze Age Aegean population substrate, partly Mycenaean, partly pre-Greek, that predates even the rise of classical Sparta by more than 1,000 years, and which may be contributing ancient genetic signals that modern researchers sometimes mistake for Spartan markers, when in fact they are older than Sparta itself. No single explanation has been confirmed as the dominant one. What the evidence increasingly suggests is that all 3 forces were likely present at different points across the centuries, folded together inside surnames that were never designed to encode a single, stable bloodline in the first place. The turning point came with a broader ancient DNA study, one that moved beyond modern surname sampling and instead compared skeletal remains recovered from Bronze Age and Classical era burial sites across the Peloponnese to the genomes of modern Laconian families. This mattered because ancient DNA does not rely on any name, tradition, or record. It reads ancestry directly from the bone. The comparison revealed that classical period individuals from the broader Spartan region already carried a genetically diverse ancestry profile, a blend of earlier Aegean populations with signals connected to Bronze Age population movements from the wider Eastern Mediterranean and Anatolia. In other words, Spartan ancestry, even at its historical peak, was never a single pure genetic type waiting to be preserved. It was already a composite by the time the city reached its height. That was the twist the surname records alone could never have revealed. Not a single warrior bloodline surviving intact across 2,500 years. Not even a genetically distinct Spartan population separate from its neighbors. Something closer to a regional mosaic, ancient Aegean ancestry, Bronze Age contact populations, and later medieval newcomers, all layered beneath surnames that families understood, sincerely and reasonably, as proof of a single unbroken line. The surprise was not that mixing occurred across Greek history. Migration and contact never stopped in the Eastern Mediterranean. The surprise was how early the mixing began, long before Sparta was even a city, and how persistently it continued long after the city itself had faded into legend. This matters beyond 14 surnames and one famous ancient city-state. It touches something larger about how every population tells its own origin story. We prefer a single ancestor, a single founding moment, a name that functions like a sealed vessel carrying pure blood forward through time. But genomes do not preserve vessels. They preserve networks. Every marriage, every migration, every unrecorded arrival folded quietly into the next generation, whether or not anyone chose to write it down. Travel today into the hills above the Eurotas Valley, where the ruins of ancient Sparta sit low and unassuming against the landscape, easy to miss if you did not already know what you were looking at. The mountains of Taygetos rise sharply to the west, their slopes holding villages that have watched empires pass beneath them, Roman governors, Byzantine monks, Ottoman garrisons, and finally the modern Greek state. Stand there, in the wind moving down from the ridgeline, and it becomes difficult to imagine any bloodline staying sealed against that much history moving through it. The land itself seems to argue for mixture, not purity, a place where nearly every century left something behind. That is the deeper inheritance carried by these 14 surnames. Not proof of a single Spartan ancestor, preserved untouched across millennia. Evidence of confluence, an ancient regional identity, real and significant, layered. Over and over by the ordinary, continuous movement of human beings across one of history's most contested landscapes. The old story said these names marked descendants of Sparta's legendary warriors, an unbroken line stretching back to the age of Leonidas. The genome tells something more honest, and in its own way more remarkable, that Spartan identity itself was never as genetically sealed as the legend required, and that the families carrying these names today are heirs not to a single bloodline, but to thousands of years of a region absorbing, adapting, and quietly becoming something new, again and again, while never fully letting go of what came before. If you carry one of these names, or simply find yourself drawn to the places where legend and genetics do not quite agree, let me know in the comments which population or ancient identity deserves this kind of investigation next. Sparta, it turns out, was never as sealed as the story we inherited.